I propose to answer questions number 85 and 99 together.
85, 99.
Thank you, Lascan Corla. Research evidence shows that early and prolonged periods of unemployment during a person's lifetime can have a permanent scarring effect on that person's capacity to improve their standard of living. This is a particular problem during an economic downturn, as young people tend to suffer the impact of job losses more than any other age group. It's estimated that about 7.5 million young people are neither in education, training or employment. This group of people are often referred to as the NEETs group, the people not in education, training or employment across the EU. This is therefore an issue that needs urgent and concerted attention at EU level, and it's an issue that the Irish Government identified as a core agenda item for the Irish EU presidency. Under my chairmanship, the Council of Employment, Social Policy, Health and Consumer Affairs Ministers, called EPSCO, last Thursday, agreed a recommendation on an EU-wide youth guarantee. The EPSCO recommendation is that each Member State should ensure that young people receive a quality offer of employment and continued education, an apprenticeship or traineeship within 4 months of becoming unemployed and subject to registering with the unemployment services in their country. The recommendation will now move to be considered for the formal adoption by the Council at a later stage in Ireland's presidency, most likely in May. And it encourages Member States to implement the provisions as soon as possible once it's formally adopted. It's also recognised that implementation will need to be more gradual in countries with higher levels of youth unemployment and particularly severe budgetary problems. In anticipation of the formal adoption of the recommendation, the Government will review the current range of youth employment and training policies in Ireland to assess what measures will need to be taken to commence the gradual implementation of the guarantee. And I can say as well that in the budgetary negotiations, a budget heading of €6 billion over the lifetime of the multi-annual financial framework has been set aside, the first time it's been done for this specific heading, and that in itself, although not as much money as I would like to see, that is actually a progressive step. So hopefully this framework pathway for young people to get education, training and ultimately into employment, it will be the beginning of a sustained downward movement in youth unemployment as the economy recovers. Even so, the implementation of a guarantee will certainly require an expansion of the range of opportunities currently on offer to young people in the form of further education, training, internships, subsidised private sector recruitment and supports for self-employment. In this regard, this state already provides a significant number of places which are available to young people, and the Department of Social Protection took steps in budget of 2013 to increase funding and places for schemes such as JobBridge, Community Employment TUS, and a new state employment scheme in the local local government sector. In total, an additional 10,000 places will be provided, and the Department of Education has made provision in the new Momentum programme, which is providing 6,500 new training places, many of which I hope will be taken up by young people. And a new recruitment incentive, Jobs Plus, is also being developed by my department. It was approved by the Government as part of the Action Plan for Jobs. This incentive will cover the cost of the employer's contribution to social welfare. That currently is for an 18-month period. That period will be extended.
Minister, I welcome the proposal. It's a pity that the EU haven't had the urgency to date to deal with this issue, but maybe better late than never. I want to find out a bit more about the specifics, because one of the problems with often these announcements is that there's a guarantee, and you said quality, but we don't have the specifics. So can you guarantee that these are jobs or training opportunities of quality, that they're not yellow-pack jobs, that there's no displacement of existing jobs involved, that in the case of training, that in fact there is proper training, unlike, for instance, in TUS, where the state doesn't provide any training, where if the person is lucky, the jobs that they're placed with manage to give those people training during the year. And what happens at the end is this guarantee that we will place you for 6 months, a year, and is it just shifting people around from being on the live register to being in a job for 6 months, back on the dole and whatever? They're issues that obviously you will address in the next number of months, but if you can give us some guideline, because I don't want to be negative on this, because I think across Europe we need to get young people in particular into employment, and hopefully that's where we start to rebuild.
The Deputy Minister.
Well, as Minister for Social Protection, in facing into the EU presidency and considering it, almost 2 years ago now, I certainly identified this as being a critical area because, for instance, although in Ireland our unemployment rate, as you know, has moved down, thankfully, we're still at a very high level, and in the case of young people right throughout Europe, it's almost double the over 25 rate of unemployment, because obviously young people coming new to the labour market, there aren't that many jobs available, therefore they, in a depressed labour market, they face particular problems. I have to say I have been meeting regularly with the EU Commissioner for Social Affairs and with fellow ministers across Europe, pressing on them, that in the context of Europe, it's difficult to envisage a social Europe, which is a critical part of Europe, that will countenance an unemployment rate of 50% and over in some of the countries which are facing severe economic difficulties. Now, in terms of fleshing out the details, all I can say at this point is that, first of all, the agreement based on the work done in particular by Eurofound, the foundation in Ireland, which is actually headquartered in Ireland for living and working conditions, has been an agreement broadly to focus on young people who are not in education, employment or training, because they're the people most at risk of long-term unemployment.
Thank you, Minister.
Secondly, then, we have the agreement about the budget heading of €6 billion, provisionally at the moment. Perhaps that we'll know the outcome of that after the European Parliament has deliberated with the Council President, and therefore I will come back to the Deputy as we pin down and we get it passed in full, if you like, at the May Council. Wow. But the agreement is, I hope, a very good signal for Europe going in the direction of social Europe.
Thank you. Deputy D, similar question.
I like the other speaker, I welcome the initiative, because we're in a situation here whereas there has been some very marginal improvements in the number of people at work, largely due to part-time, 14,000 part-time jobs being created in the last 6 months. Nevertheless, the number of people under the age of 35 at work continues to fall, perhaps reflecting the fact that immigration is still very much a feature of the Irish landscape. But I just want to ask the Minister, I think the figure she mentioned was 6 billion, the provisional figure was 6 billion over the lifetime of the programme, is that right? Have you any idea how that's going to break down in relation to what we'll be entitled to from that, and what sort of matching funds? Is there any estimate being done on what sort of matching funds the government is going to have to provide to make the guarantee a reality here, year after year, during the lifetime of the programme? And can I also say to the Minister that it's not just a question of, as I understand it, a question of guaranteeing a job. If you can't get a job, you're guaranteed that you'll go into education. Now, the Minister will be aware that people who are long-term unemployed, in particular, a lot of them go into the fourth level education. I mean, the government has cut provision for fourth level education this year. The pupil-teacher ratio has been increased from 15 to 17, and the TUI, which the union representing the teachers providing this type of education, said they'll be able to deal with less applicants this year than last year.
Minister.
The government in particular, in terms of additional provision this year, has established, and you'll probably have heard it being advertised on media, the Momentum Programme. That's a scheme for education and training interventions. And the critical thing about that is that that training has been targeted at areas where there is employment available. I think in the review which was done for my department in relation to, for instance, the various schemes that the Department of Social Protection supports, we're spending roughly 200 million this year in a 1 billion plus package on employment supports. 200 million to support people back into education. Now, I think one of the things that's important in terms of supporting people back into education is that we're all aware that there are areas, for instance, where there are job vacancies, IT probably being the most obvious one, and that we should specifically seek to, if you like, help people when they go back into education to subsequently help them back into work. The Department of Social Protection, up to the changes that I've been making, was largely a passive department. If you qualified for a payment, you got the payment, and you could be left there alone for forever after. We've been changing that into having an active service, not just to help people back to education in the new intro offices, but to help them back into employment. So it's part of a coherent structure and framework of helping young people to get, particularly their first job.
Could I have brief questions from the deputies offering Deputy Osnody?
Minister, it's in relation to the funding as well, but also in relation to emigration. You mentioned the fact that the numbers of unemployed is down, but also the number of employed is up slightly. And given that young people in particular are emigrating in huge numbers, when do you expect this proposal to become live, so that kind of some hope can go out to those young people who are at the current time considering emigrating, and the funding? Can you ensure that in your discussions that the funding be, if you want, front-loaded as much as possible, so that the effect can then have its own momentum?
Deputy O'D. Same question. Deputy Wallace and Deputy Murphy. Briefly, please. I'll just have time for Deputy Murphy. Deputy Wallace first.
Minister, no doubt any employment supports from the government are to be welcomed. But given that our youth unemployment is at 30% at the moment, and we're looking at the Europeans of Greece, Spain and Italy at over 50, and ours is probably only down at 30 because so many of ours are emigrating. Would you not, you say, Minister, that impact of job losses is severe on the youth, but the impact of austerity, more so than in a normal climate of just job losses, is very dramatic on young people. And I would say that an awful lot of young people move into the domestic economy first at a young age, and the domestic economy at the moment has failed to recover for a number of reasons. Aside from upwardly-only rents, and rates are actually going up still, energy costs are still going up, and the banks are still closed. It's impossible to get money out of a bank still. Do you not think that the government, you can throw all the support you like at this initiative, but until you actually deal with the domestic economy, it's going to be very hard to come up with the good figures that you'd like?
Thank you. Deputy Murphy.
Thank you, Lachlan Cola. And just to welcome the initiative and to congratulate the Minister on all the work that she is doing in Europe in this regard. I'm really on a point of clarification, Minister. If the recommendation is agreed at the European level, are we then to see that the measures that can be taken up by unemployed people, the thresholds come down? For example, with the Back to Education allowance, whereby if you want to avail of third-level education, you have to be unemployed for a period of up to 9 months. Does that mean that that period will then come down to this new 3 or 4 month threshold? And will that apply across the other schemes as well for people who are unemployed?
Thank you. Final reply on this question.
Yes, in relation to the funding, all of this in relation to Deputy O'Snuddick's question and Deputy O'D's previous question, All of the funding amounts have to be finalised, but in general, these funds would be within the envelope of European social funds and cohesion funds. I can't give you a final figure, except that President Van Rompuy's indicative figure was 6 billion, 3 billion of which, if you like, was in the context of current resources, and 3 billion which was additional. But I am conscious of the fact that President Van Rompuy has to finalise and negotiate that with the European Parliament, and I know that the European Parliament and parties throughout it and groups have been extremely supportive of the development of a youth guarantee. When will it start? Assuming that all goes well, it would be due to start when the next budgetary period starts, which is the beginning of 2014. But it would be necessary, therefore, to look at how it affects different countries. And one of the suggestions which has been made is that for countries with a youth unemployment rate above 25%, which would include ourselves, that some of the spending and the activities would be front-loaded, because, to take up Deputy Wallace's point, when you have a depressed economy, one of the important areas for youth training and education would be apprenticeships, but as I'm sure Deputy Wallace knows, that has fallen on very, very lean times indeed because of the collapse in construction. So we're talking about building a platform and a framework to help as many young people as possible to get education and training. And just let me say briefly, in Finland and Sweden, they had bad banking collapses, and one of the things that helped them subsequently was during that period of the collapse, when the economies were recovering, they invested in education and training, and that paid enormous dividends when the time came when the economy had recovered.
The next question is in the name of